Welcome back to Freedom Factor and another episode of Hot Take. In today's episode, if you couldn't tell from the title, we're going to talk about qualified immunity. On this episode, I'm going to discuss qualified immunity, what it is, what it isn't, the, I guess you could say, the positive and negative aspects, and then where I stand, as always. And so let's get right into it. So first off, what is qualified immunity? Well, it's not a catch-all for when police do wrong, and it doesn't just allow them to do whatever they want. So we're going to get that misconception right out of the way on the get-go. So what does it actually do? Well, the legal definition of qualified immunity is a protection afforded to state and local government officials, in this case police officers, but it also applies to other professions, from civil suit by persons making the claim that the officer violated their rights, except in cases where the officer violated a, quote, clearly established, end quote, natural, legal, or constitutional right. This is not a protection from criminal prosecution and only protects the officer themselves, not the agency, city, county, or state. The burden of proof is that it must be determined if the officer could have reasonably known his or her actions would violate the plaintiff's rights. Essentially, it protects government employees from civil liability in the commission of their duties within the scope of those duties. For example, if a police officer is attempting to arrest somebody and that person is resisting arrest, and during the commission of, or during the effection of that arrest, the police officer breaks their wrist while they're legally attempting to arrest that person for a crime, the qualified immunity basically protects the officer while they're doing their job from civil liability, so long as they were acting within the scope of that effort and within the scope of their duties of their job. Now, if they break the law or they do something to violate policy that's not covered under qualified immunity, they are subject to other penalties such as criminal and or civil penalties. So it basically has to be that they have to violate a right that's clearly established as a right and by, predicate case law. So there has to be, basically it has to be a clearly established right, or there has to be an act done that falls within what a previous case law outlined. And this kind of, clears the air a little bit on what qualified immunity does. This concept differs from absolute immunity, which is something that other offices like judges, members of Congress, and prosecutors enjoy. And this may be where the misconception is, that people view qualified immunity as being congruous to absolute immunity, or even government immunity, which governmental immunity is another concept that can range from absolute or qualified depending upon the jurisdiction. So why does this matter? Well, for starters, it reduces frivolous lawsuits that the officer has to deal with, and as they can be dismissed on the grounds of the officer acting, basically they didn't violate anyone's rights and they're acting within the scope of policy and their duties. It does not alleviate civil liability for the agency, department, city, or county in which they work with. That can be brought up. There can be lawsuits brought on that, but it basically protects officers from being personally sued. And basically, so it enables them to be able to do their job without fear of risking losing property or assets just by doing their jobs. And it also falls into the reasonableness standard, which is a standard that is basically a legal and civil standard. Removing this protection, however, does not really actually stop police from doing bad things. If the cop breaks the law, they are still criminally and civilly liable for that violation, just like anybody else. Eliminating qualified immunity doesn't slow or stop bad cops. It doesn't solve the problem. It only serves to create new problems, which there are some negative ramifications being viewed in places where qualified immunity has been eliminated, such as, for instance, Colorado. Currently, Colorado is facing a law enforcement problem where police agencies are suffering the lowest retention and recruiting numbers in decades, and departments, due to retention and recruiting, are short staffed, and therefore they're seeing some follow on effects such as increased response time and higher call volume per officer. This also reduces the ability of these law enforcement agencies to conduct directed patrols, such as doing. Full disclosure, I used to work in law enforcement, and I'm trying not to allow any bias to come in with a kind of analytical approach to qualified immunity. But one of the directed patrols that I was instructed to take part in when I worked was setting up traffic enforcement during starting and finishing school hours in school zones, where basically I would sit and I would have radar and try and stop people from speeding in school zones during the times of start and end of school. That's a directed patrol. There's also a reduction and a lack of ability for law enforcement agencies to conduct proactive policing, which if anywhere in the Denver metro area of Colorado, you can see kind of the effects of that. There are not that many police driving around patrolling. They're more going to and from calls, and there's not as much in the way of traffic enforcement or speed traps. They happen from time to time, but they're very, very infrequent. They're not nearly as frequent as they used to be. Some people see this as a good thing. I'll just say there's two sides to this coin. A lot of people will falsely claim that traffic enforcement is a revenue-generating endeavor by law enforcement agencies. Having been on the inside and been able to see that for myself, it's really not. They don't make a whole lot of money from traffic enforcement, let me tell you. And the big misconception, I could do a whole video on a lot of the misconceptions with regard to law enforcement. Big misconception is that traffic enforcement does not net very much revenue generation. Most of the revenue generated for law enforcement agencies, at least where I live, it basically comes mostly from property taxes. Not a whole lot, and a lot of funding for law enforcement agencies also comes from federal grants. People don't realize just how much federal grants go to local law enforcement. But on top of that, most of the funding for your emergency services comes from property tax. So that's a big misconception. So moving on. While accountability for law enforcement is important and extremely necessary, qualified immunity is not an aspect, the removal of which will increase accountability. It is a claim that it is, but it really doesn't increase accountability. The barrier for qualified immunity does help with accountability, because if an officer does violate someone's rights and it is clearly established they did, qualified immunity doesn't even apply, and therefore there's still accountability. The employment of body cameras, revision of training standards and policies, especially with regard to use of force, have all been net benefits on enabling police to have increased accountability and transparency, and the enactment of civilian oversight boards with regard to policy and police actions, especially in helping to revise and rewrite and modify policy, has also been beneficial. And those are very good things. Having the public come in, because really you want to increase, you want to do a better job of kind of increasing the nexus between police and public. You want to kind of get more public involvement in how police do their jobs. Not so much people telling police how to do their jobs, but just basically how they perceive police. That needs to be overcome. That's something that can benefit better than just saying we need to end qualified immunity. However, as seen with the socio-political climate following incidents like George Floyd, calls for defunding the police have led to more detriments than benefits. And I could do a whole video on defund police and kind of walk through all that, but broad strokes, the idea of defunding police while demanding more accountability and better police training is completely absurd. They fly in the face of each other. Restricting how much funding is available to law enforcement agencies is not going to lead to better trained officers. It's going to lead to lesser trained officers. And this is a simple economic analysis that many fail to acknowledge. I don't even know where to begin to explain this. If you want better cops, taking money away from them is not going to result in that. A lot of agencies that don't get a whole lot of funding do the bare minimum to maintain officers being qualified to do the job. Like, for instance, a lot of states have a standards board that certifies police officers. Like, for instance, in Colorado, it's the Police Officer Standards and Training Board. They have set forth guidelines with minimum amounts of training that police officers, in order to maintain their certification, must accomplish every year. There is a certain hour requirement, especially with perishable skills such as firearms, driving, arrest control. They also dictate that they have to have a certain amount of legal update training, because laws change and police need to know what those changes are and what the laws are. And so there's a lot of agencies that only meet the bare minimum, and those officers just meet the bare minimum for being qualified police officers and to maintain their certification. And therefore, defunding the police basically makes it so that everybody basically meets just that bare minimum and doesn't go above and beyond. I had the pleasure of working with a pair of agencies, two agencies that were pretty well funded, and we got a lot of training. We received quite a bit more than just the bare minimum. Of course, we met those goals pretty quickly, and it was broken up, but we also did additional training throughout the year. But the problem is with, and I could do a whole long video on this, but the problem is with defunding police is that that hurts the kind of idea of being a well-trained police force, for the simple fact that training costs money. I know that's a weird concept to kind of try and figure out and understand, but it does. It's true. You typically, like, for instance, patrol, which I can say I've worked and I can kind of give insight into that, is that, like, for instance, patrol shifts, some agencies will do 410s. So you'll have officers work, let's say, Sunday through Wednesday, and then the other side of the week will work Wednesday through Saturday. The Wednesday there is referred to, kind of in some agencies, a power day, where they allot for training on Wednesdays. Sometimes some agencies will give them, like, you'll work every other Wednesday. You'll work either 32 or 38 or 42 hours or something like that. And it balances out at the end of the pay period for working the set, the 40-hour work week, quote unquote. But a lot of agencies will use an overlap day or something like that, where they can the officers are already on shift or whatever. But in terms of a normal kind of schedule, training has to be done outside of your normal work hours, so you don't have a lacking in manpower. Because police are 24 hours a day kind of job, 24/7, 365, rain, snow, sleet, hail, whatever. And so you need to maintain a shift of police officers on duty. So where do you squeeze that training in has to be figured out, because, police officers don't work for free. You have to pay them. You have to pay the trainers. And sometimes that pay goes into overtime or goes into an allotted training time that they have to complete. But at any rate, training costs money. And that's a thing that people don't understand. If you want your police force to be proficient and competent, you need to train them. And training costs money. So, moving on. Where do I stand on this? Well, I stand on the side of logic and rational analysis. Does policing in America need to be examined and reformed? Absolutely. And I'm saying this as a former law enforcement officer. There are a lot of changes that need to be made in law enforcement in America today. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I agree that there are a lot of things that can be improved upon with regard to how policing is conducted in the United States in 2024. There are a lot of aspects of the job that need to be fixed. from training to mentality, even the equipment available to individual officers not serving within specialized roles. Another major issue, and again, this is something I could do a huge long video on, big issue regarding policing in America that needs to be addressed is the process of civil asset forfeiture. And again, that's a discussion for another video, but I will broadly say that civil asset forfeiture is not conducive to the due process rights detailed in the Constitution, namely the Fifth Amendment, which clearly states, and I quote, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation," end quote. Civil asset forfeiture violates this, as most cases the property, money, or items seized by the state oftentimes are seized pre-conviction or even sometimes without any conviction at all. And again, that's a conversation for another video another time, but it's something that needs to be addressed. Now, I could do an entire video on the issues arising from the various mentalities that are pervasive within the law enforcement community and within their training, such as the us versus them mentality that is extremely toxic and needs to be completely gone away with, where police view themselves as separate from the people that they serve, as well as this whole warrior mentality. And I say this as a combat veteran and a former cop. The warrior mentality kind of disgusts me in law enforcement. I really do think so. And a lot of it is officers are trained to treat every interaction as having a potential to deteriorate into a violent confrontation, and that they should be on guard and always ready for that. And that is not productive to a civilian law enforcement action within a peaceful populace. And I mean, really, if you essentially look at it, America's a relatively peaceful country. Do we have problems? Yes. Do we have violence? Absolutely. But in the broad strokes, really the majority of police contact with people does not result in violence. And so going into those situations, I think, is a bad idea if you're expecting violence every single time, especially on a traffic stop with like grandma, and you're like going in with the mentality and the kind of alertness that you're expecting grandma to jump out with a full auto AK-47 to start spraying your car. That's just ridiculous. And really, it's more akin to what an occupying military force would adopt serving in a hostile fire zone. And I don't think law enforcement needs to have that kind of mentality going into every situation. Should they be alert and aware? Yes, but they shouldn't go in expecting the absolute worst to happen every single time. And also that leads to some very bad psychological effects too. Officers will end up being stressed beyond belief, and that's going to lead to an early grave, essentially. So this is the kind of issue that should be addressed. There are tons of solutions, and I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be. I don't have all the answers, but essentially in my pretty well-educated opinion on this, is the solution is not ending qualified immunity. I think a good solution would be like providing officers with avenues in which to report wrongdoing among their peers without fear or animosity or reprisal, or what I would call the Serpico syndrome. When their coworkers are doing the wrong thing, there should be a way for them to be able to report that and eliminate any animosity or reprisal, because there's still some issues. However, I will say, and really, I mean, trust me on this, good cops hate bad cops more than people outside of law enforcement do. And we can definitely have the conversation with regard to police reforms, but seriously, like, everybody should know that good cops hate bad cops. And I could talk about this, in a much longer, more detailed video. Please leave a comment if you want me to, because of my unique perspective. And let me tell you, it was very difficult being a libertarian police officer. Like that, I will tell you that it was you have a lot of it was difficult, but not impossible. And they do exist. There are plenty of cops out there who are libertarians. So that whole thing with the whole libertarian and police, that rift, it's it's weird. Anyway, but I mean, simply put, like with it, I could go into really big detail, but I won't on for the purposes of this video. But it's like police really, it's difficult to get rid of the bad cops. I mean, really because of the whole, we give so many rights to the accused in this country, and for good cause too, because like that age-old saying goes, better to let 100 guilty men go free than one innocent man pay the price. And that is kind of, that also applies to police officers. You have to have evidence of wrongdoing, and you can't just base it on feelings or anything like that. So for the purposes of this, I really think that the elimination of qualified immunity essentially doesn't solve the problem. It instead shifts the exposure police face from professional to personal. And, I just wanted to clear up some of the misunderstanding and misconceptions on this topic. And that's the whole goal. Really, if it's not to change people's mind into loving the police. Really, a lot of the hate for police is misappropriated, and a lot of people hate police for the simple fact, and it could be the anti-authoritarian thing. They see police as an agent of the state that is the quote unquote boot on the neck. That's where I don't align with that libertarian belief that police are the boot on people's necks. There has to be a balance, though, and I would definitely, we can definitely have that conversation at another time. But in closing, I really do hope that this was informative. I hope that this helps the dialogue with respect to this controversial topic. Thank you for tuning in. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. Don't forget, if you like the content, please like, share, subscribe. And I appreciate and welcome any constructive comments, feedback, and dialogue on this and any other issues that I discuss. So, without further ado, thank you so much, and I will catch you all in the next one.